Dialogues. I'm just going to give another minute for everybody to come in, and in our usual way of starting, if you want to pop a note of greeting to the group in the chat, please do, and let us know where you're calling in from today. As you can see, I'm in the exact same place I've been for a while now, but maybe some of you are in a different location. I hope everybody's well. So knowing how dynamic and packed these sessions always are, and we have really tremendous speakers today, I'm just going to kick off with a word of welcome before I hand over to Otto. So for those of you that are joining us for the first time, welcome to our dialogue series on transforming systems for the decade of action. This is an intentionally different space which we have created and hold together for these dialogues. There is absolutely nothing required of you. So this is an opportunity to take a collective breath. It's an opportunity for us to reflect together on what we're seeing and experiencing in the disruption of COVID. And it's an opportunity for you to tap into your own knowing, your own experiences, and also to connect with others in the room, and especially with our speakers that are coming in today on some really important insights and experiences. So as we've walked through the dialogues, for those of you that are joining for the first time, we have followed the Theory U approach, and Otto has led us through that. We've had a session where we've really looked at downloading at some of the gaps or blind spots that we can have in the way that we think about ourselves and each other, and how that can actually prohibit or inhibit systems change and systems transformation. And that was a session where we had invited in some Indigenous scholars to help us understand and sense into the experience of those more on the margins or periphery of systems. We moved into a session, our last one, with Julia Kim. We did an individual assessment of our gross national happiness, or lack, or complete, or lack thereof in some cases. And that was an opportunity for us to shift gears a little bit from an internal reflection to presencing, and really thinking through, what do we need to let go of? What is emerging? What are we welcoming in to our lives and to this space? And as we move into the discussion today, Otto will say this better, but this is really an opportunity for us to think through crystallizing, prototyping, what is emerging, and how do we capitalize on these opportunities to support transformation in our lives, of course, in the context that we're all joining today and the work that we do around the world. So that is just by way of introduction. I'm really delighted that we have Kate Raworth and Jamila Mahmood joining us today. Otto, I know you'll introduce a little bit further both of them and open up the discussion. In terms of the format for the session, colleagues, same as we always do this, we'll open up first to Otto to an exchange with our invited guests, some opportunities within there for you to reflect on your own through journaling and through small group discussions. This is a practice space, so this is an opportunity for us to practice the skills that we want to take into a systems transformation in the work that we do in our communities and so on. So for those of you that are able to stay for the full 90 minutes and are willing, please do consider joining the smaller groups, which will take place towards the end of the session. It really is an opportunity for you that it is not the same experience in the dynamic of the plenary and listening into. So that's an opportunity for direct practice that we hope that you will take. Otto, over to you, and welcome everyone.
Thank you, Laurel. Welcome to everyone also from my end. So the title of the series is Transforming Systems in the Decade of Action, and the focus of today's session is co-creating the emerging future, Doughnut economics. And I want to kick it off with just one simple analogy on the transforming systems part of our conversation. And the analogy is this: it's kind of our smartphones. And there are two things, and apply that to the systems thinking and systems transformation. So there are two things we can really do with our smartphones. One is loading new apps, which gives us new capabilities, and the other one is upgrading the operating system. And when we talk about transforming systems, we basically mean the latter, right? We mean kind of upgrading the operating system. And we all know that when we talk about social or societal systems, it's not like plugging in and hitting on agree, but it's a struggle, right? It's a struggle that can take years, decades, or longer. And I want to just quickly apply that lens to situate our conversation and look at the changes we all are working with just for a moment from that angle. So when you, for example, look at health and learning, kind of the old operating system, so that's no longer there in most cases, traditional, right, doctor-centric or teacher-centric ways of learning. Today's mainstream is more 2.0, which is not input and authority-centric, but output and efficiency-centric. Evidence-based medicine, teaching for testing, basically, also known as bulimia learning, fast in, fast out, which is not real learning. So which brings us to 3.0, which is outcome and user-centric. So here we talk about patient-centric medicine, kind of reorganizing healthcare around patient journeys, or learner or student-centric ways of learning. So that's the good healthcare system, the good school. Is that the future? I don't think so. I think we are moving towards something that you could call 4.0, co-creative ecosystem-centric, moving from just addressing symptoms of pathology towards strengthening sources of well-being. Think about social determinants of health, or whole person, whole systems ways of learning, where learning really takes place in the context of community and social and systems change. If you apply the same things to farm and food, traditional industrial agriculture, right, output and efficiency centric, you could say the mother of half our environmental problems. 3.0, organic agriculture, that's better. Reducing negative footprint, is it good enough? Probably not. Regenerative agriculture, food as medium for healing planet and people. Think about the capacity in agroforestry and regenerative agriculture to sequester in carbon and so forth. Finance, traditional, externality blind, right? Think Wall Street 2.0, efficiency centric. Then today we talk about impact investing, ESG. That's a step in the right direction. Is it good enough? Probably not. Because what we really need to do is to address the deeper root issues at play and address them by transforming and evolving the systems we are operating with. Governance, right? At the end of the day, a lot is about governance, from the visible hand to the invisible hand to organize interest groups. Today we have those three mainly. But what we need from a governance perspective is really awareness-based collective action, really decentralizing governance kind of to the community level, kind of where all the key players are coming together. And then lastly, underlying the Human Development Report, of course, is the question of how we the development concept, right? Moving from mercantilism or just GDP orientation to human well-being, right? That's kind of where UNDP and the HDR and HDI is coming in. And now, as we are discussing, so we really move that to a lens that centers not just around human well-being, but human and planetary well-being. The planetary pressure adjusted HDI, the GNH, what we discussed last time, or the Doughnut economic concepts, all addressing that dimension. So in a way, the issue we have is how to move from a world So the backdrop really is systems thinking means you cannot address 4.0 challenges with mindsets and a thinking that is rooted in 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. So that's our bigger shift. And that's why Kate's work and Jamila's work is so relevant, because it is really at the threshold of moving us as a system from the 2.0 and 3.0 into a 4.0, a co-creative ecosystem-centric ways of operating. And that's, Kate, to start with you, we are so happy that you and Jamila are joining us. So Kate probably doesn't need an introduction here in this UN context, but she is author, of course, of this kind of fantastic book, Doughnut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. She's co-founder of the Doughnut Economics Action Lab. And just to kick it off, Kate, I want to give you a set of 3 questions kind of before turning it over to you for a little input. What's the essence of thinking like a 21st century economist, right? So what's kind of the gist of that? Most of us are familiar with that, but just kind of what's your current take on that? Can you give us a concrete example, application example of Doughnut economics? And maybe as a starting point, as we are living through a moment of profound disruption, what is it that you see and sense happening from your angle? Do you see the seeds of a new global movement for profound economic transformation taking shape? And if so, where do you see it? Since your work is very much instrumental of kind of catalyzing collective action and maybe kind of contributing, also convening a new way of activism among stakeholders that previously didn't really connect together in this way. And that's what we are really so interested in, and where you have a really unique angle kind of and perspective into that. Over to you, Kate.
Brilliant. Thank you, Otto. And it's just a big pleasure to be here. I love the stages you just showed, because I just saw my own life and career right in there on the last one you showed about the economy. When I was a student in the late 1980s, if you wanted to look at the comparison of the world's governments, you would have to pull out the World Development Report published by the World Bank, and it published the world's nations in terms of GDP per capita and GDP growth. So I was born into 2.0 of GDP. I then worked as part of UNDP. I was a member of the Human Development Report team for 4 years in the late 1990s. And so the HDI is my lifeblood. And I was part of the team writing that report. And I witnessed what happens when you move from the World Development Report measuring GDP to the Human Development Report measuring human development, and that fabulous renaissance of thinking that came through UNDP adopting that. And I always was rankling with the fact that I had to go on the radio in Canada or Norway or Australia or whichever country had come at the top of the index again and say, yes, well done, Canada, you're at the top of the HDI, knowing full well that the way that Canadians were living was environmentally damaging. And so I'm really delighted then to move from that 3.0 to the 4.0, which is reflected in this year's Human Development Report and reflected in the Doughnut, which is to say we have to recognize the impact that nations have in the world as well. So that was just actually really wonderful for me to just see. So I'm going to share some slides, because for me, images are incredibly important. Could somebody enable my screen sharing? That would be very helpful right now. And I'm going to, yes, I'm definitely going to talk about what being a 21st century economist means to me. And I will give you an example of how we've been downscaling it in the context of cities. So here we are. We have begun the 21st century facing repeated crises. We've had the financial meltdown of 2008. We live in an era of climate and ecological breakdown, and we've just endured COVID lockdown. And these crises tell us how connected we are with each other and with the rest of the living world. But most importantly, I believe these crises emerge from the systems we've created. They emerge from systems that are based upon endless expansion. If you aim to endlessly expand finance, you will kick off a crisis. Subprime mortgage market. We endlessly expand our use of fossil fuels and Earth's materials, we create climate and ecological breakdown. If we endlessly expand into spaces of wildlife, coupled with endless air travel, we create perfect conditions for a global health pandemic. Human progress does not lie in endless expansion. That is not the shape of prosperity. We need to change deep in our minds the shape of prosperity. And for this, I offer a different shape. This donut shape. The aim is to leave nobody in the hole in the middle, falling short on the essentials of life. Those 12 in the middle should look very familiar. They are the social priorities of the Sustainable Development Goals. So all the governments of the world have already agreed to this. Leave nobody in the hole. But at the same time, don't overshoot that outer ring. These are the 9 planetary boundaries, the life support systems that keep Earth in this delicately balanced, beautiful, benevolent state that is so benevolent to humanity. So meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. It sounds obvious. It should be obvious. And I think the first point of 21st century economics is to start with this as the obvious goal. We have to state a goal. Otherwise, we have no idea how to measure progress. Trouble is, we are well out of balance right now. All the red in the middle shows the extent to which people are falling short on the essentials of life. And we are collectively overshooting planetary boundaries. And to me, this is our collective selfie. And we're the first generation to see this. It is our picture, our challenge. And we just have to remind ourselves that last century's economic theories and last century's governmental policies and last century's business models and practices were not designed to solve for this. So we'd be crazy to think that they were going to get us there. We have to come up with theories and policies and business models of our own if we want to turn this story around, which is surely the task of our times. So here are 3 national donuts created by my brilliant colleague, Andrew Fanning. They show us on the one hand, Malawi, red in the middle, significant human shortfall, not overshooting any planetary boundaries. In the center there is China on around $17,000 per person per year, both falling short on meeting people's needs and in overshoot, many countries in this position. And then we have Norway, which is one of those countries that's always near the top of the Human Development Index. Well done, Norway. Your central circle is blue, but look at your overshoot. And that, of course, is what's always been missing from the HDI. And it's very impactful. I have to say, I recently have presented this story in Norway, in Australia, in Canada, all over Zoom, of course. And people's faces do drop. And people feel it because they are used to living in the country that is the best place in the world to live. And they feel it and they see it. And there's something very powerful. I can sense it in the room when they see this. This is not the story of ourselves we like to tell. This is not who the world has told us we are or we've come to think we are. This is a re-reckoning. If I put these 3 countries in a context of all, the place we all want to be is that top left-hand corner, where we meet the needs of all within the means of the living planet. And you can see the 3 picked out, scaled, of course, by size. So there's no country that can say they're near. And to me, this immediately tells us there should be no nation in the world that says we are a developed country. We are an advanced nation. Why on earth would we call any country that? No country can put up its hand and say, yes, we're developed, because they're not. Not by this understanding of what well-being looks like, not by 4.0, as Otto just showed us. So I offer to everyone, just remove that language, because if we continue to call high-income nations developed, we create a very false story of what developing is towards and who can say they're there and who needs to be learning from whom. We must all learn from each other. Low-income countries have to meet the needs of all people for the first time, already coming back without overshooting planetary boundaries in the way that every nation before them has done. So that's never been done before. This is totally unprecedented. And how are they going to do that? And middle income nations have the double whammy of meeting people's needs for the first time, already coming back within planetary boundaries. How are they going to do that? And then high income nations should jolly well get on with the job of meeting people's needs for the first time because they have the money to do it. But they have to massively come back within planetary boundaries. And that's never been done before. So every nation here is on an unprecedented journey of progress, development, transformation. I think it calls for huge humility and simultaneously ambition. These countries, of course, do not stand apart. They are deeply interlinked by histories of colonialism, military power, ongoing trade and finance rules, resource extraction, and the current and future impacts of climate change, all of which have a strong flow from impacts generated in the global north, impacting the global south. But we all need to move in that direction. How are we going to get there? Part of being a 21st century economist for me means pulling back and starting with a new big picture. Whenever I speak to any economic student, anyone who ever studied economics, what's the first diagram you remember learning? The answer is the same the world over. Oh, supply and demand, they say. It's a phenomenally narrow perspective to begin economics with. So I offer instead this point. Let's start with the big picture. The economy is embedded in society. It is a social construct of relationships that we can reinvent. And society, human society, is embedded within the living world, drawing in matter, putting out waste, bathed in a river of solar energy. But let's dive inside that economy. Yes, there is the market where we may show up as consumer or producer, as creditor or debtor. That's the space where we're told as economic man. We're told he should be competitive and solitary and calculating and rational. It's not a smart way for humans ever to behave, by the way, and the best business certainly doesn't do that. But it's not just the market. There's also the state, where you may be public servant or a resident or a voter or protester, all powerful roles that we play in relation to the state. The 20th century obsessed with these two. There's ideological battle between them, and these are what show up in GDP, but of course far more matters. The household where we begin every day. There's parent, partner, relative, or child. And the commons, where we may be a volunteer or sharer or co-creator or steward, creating those commonly held resources. One thing that COVID's made clear is that when market spaces are physically closed down for the need for physical distancing, the state steps in, and then we all remember whose work is essential work. The household steps in, sometimes with joy, sometimes with incredible tension, and this commons step in through food banks and just merely looking out for our neighbors. And people the world over say what we don't want to lose post-lockdown is that sense of a we. So I want to just invite everyone actually right now in the chat box to think of yourself, bring your whole self to this work and this conversation. Think of yourself in the market and the state and the commons and the household. I'll tell you. So, and just write in the chat box some of these many roles that you weave together in your life. So if I was going to write, I would say, well, I'm a mother. I'm going to do some food shopping today. So I'm a consumer. It's the day of elections in my town and in my country, and I'm definitely going to go and vote. And I'm a member of the Commons, and I'm part of the low traffic neighborhood scheme. So just everybody pop in the chat box your experience. There we are. There's me. It would be lovely just to see people as I talk, a flow of, there we are, father, consumer of my new earphones. I hope they're doing a good job. Consultant, yes. So because we weave these roles together all the time, but we rarely name them. The mainstream economy tells us we are consumers and producers, but we are all of these things. And we need to create economies that actually make space for us to inhabit all of them. And of course, many people on this call are public servants. So as you keep on putting those names and those roles in the chat box, I'm going to keep going and bring you to the next step. Can we live in the donut? Can we downscale it to where we are? And I invite you to think of the city or region or nation where you are right now. If we unroll this donut, then we can open it up and create a space between that ecological ceiling and the social foundation where we can begin to imagine new futures. So I'm going to take you into the process we've been applying it. Otto asked for an example of downscaling it, applying it at the level of the city. And I want you to imagine this for any city that you know or love or are near to. So we ask, how can our city become a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? That is the question of what it means to bring the donut to a city perspective. And it could be broken out into 4 lenses, which are social and ecological, and they're about here, the local and the global. So the first is to ask, how can all the people of our city thrive? Who are all the people? There may be the traditional custodians and the indigenous people of place. There may be the settlers, the colonials, and there may be the most recent of immigrants. In all of their ages, their diversity, their ethnicities, their genders, all the people of this place, whether they are documented or undocumented? How can they thrive? How can everybody be healthy, enabled, connected, and empowered? Add to that, thinking about this place itself. How can our city thrive within its natural habitat? So where on planet Earth is the city you are located in? And how is nature generous there? Nature has a genius for thriving everywhere, at the top of a mountain, in a valley, in a floodplain, in a desert. Nature has a generosity of regenerating the conditions of life. Nature cleanses the air and houses biodiversity and stores carbon and cycles the water and harvests the sun's energy and regulates the temperature and builds the soil. How can our cities aspire to match or exceed nature's generosity in that place? What would it mean for the city to truly belong in that ecosystem? So these two, thriving people in a thriving place, these are our local aspirations, and we need to put them in the context of global responsibilities, because all cities, of course, are embedded. I mean, if I just look at the objects in this room around me, the clothes I'm wearing, the books on my shelves, the shelves themselves, the paint, the microphone I'm using, have come from all over the world. So we also have to ask, how can our city respect the health of the whole planet? Our consumption footprint through clothing and food and consumer goods and electronics and construction materials. How do we bring our impact? If we were a city in Norway, Oslo in Norway, we'd need to come right back within those red planetary boundaries, as all high income and many middle income cities need to do. But also, while thinking of all those global supply chains, think of the people working in those supply chains. How do we ensure that the way our city procures, or the shops and the retailers that are selling products in our city, that they respect the rights of workers worldwide, their wages, their healthcare, but also impacts on communities? A very live example, many people say, oh, to solve the fossil fuel crisis of climate change, we need to just shift from having fossil fuel cars to electric cars. Well, electric cars need lithium batteries. And if you live anywhere near a lithium mine, you would know that the global supply chains of those lithium mines are having huge impacts on their communities, on the environment and those communities themselves. How do we live well here without undermining the lives of others? Here are some examples of City Doughnut workshops we held. You can see this is pre-COVID. We held these back in late 2019 in the first 3 cities where we downscaled the Doughnut. And these are city officials together with some community members looking at their city from these multiple perspectives at the same time. The first thing I noticed in these workshops is that everybody worked on something. I work on water, you work on transport, you work on housing, we work on racial equality. But everybody could locate their issue in this portrait. So they felt recognized, they had a home, and that enabled them to reach out and see everybody else's and look at the interconnections. And you can see people drawing lines and connecting between the lenses. And then people wanted to think holistically. They really wanted to get out of the silos. And they knew that we will only come up with transformative policies if we work together and make these interconnections. So I'm going to invite you now actually to just reflect, and I invite people to put it in the chat box again, if you'd like to. Thinking of the city where you are, what do you feel has been holding your city back from fully thriving? I'm going to stop a minute and invite people to reflect in the chat box. What do you feel has been holding your city back from fully thriving? And it might be a sectoral answer, it might be something deeper, it might be something that's not normally talked about, not normally touched, that goes deeper. Racism, thank you. Lack of governance and vision, consuming from global markets, privilege, air quality, inequalities, concentration of wealth, poor services, corporate creep into politics. Okay, you guys are definitely working well with Otto here, because we're going straight down to the deep stuff that sits beneath it all. The structural inequalities and power relations, apathy, ineffective institutions, monarchy, corruption, slums, waste management, some expletives. Yes, thank you for sharing this. How do we turn this around? And these are the questions that we aim to work with cities and use a very clear aspirational framework like this to start bringing this out in the cities that are choosing to adopt this framework. There's a huge outpouring of thoughts on this. Thank you, everybody. Exclusion of the majority. Thank you so much for all that sharing. I'm going to finish by just pulling back a little bit and talking about the way that we're working as Doughnut Economics Action Lab. So Amsterdam was the first city to decide to publish, here, I have it here. Amsterdam published its city portrait that we created together with them, putting data to the story of those 4 lenses. They published it in April 2020. They published it in the month in which that city had the highest rate of COVID infection. And I know they decided to do it because they said, look, if we just delay all policy making, we'll have a massive backlog of policy when COVID ends, which is who knows when. But also, when we're in emergency right now, but when we start to emerge from this emergency, where do we want to go? Who do we want to become? We know that cracks in history open up and you have to seize them. That's when transformation happens. So let's publish this so that it gives us a vision of where we want to go. And in fact, it's a direction we already knew we wanted to go. So they published that in April 2020, and the response to it was massive. We then very rapidly published the methodology that we had used to create their city portrait, because everything that we do at Doughnut Economics Action Lab is open access. We are not consultants. We don't come in and do things for people. We create tools that if it's useful to you, please pick it up and use it and adapt it. Please just share back and bring your story back. And because it's that reciprocity that makes this flow. And within weeks and then months, many places were already starting to say, we want to pick this up, we're going to use it. Sometimes city government, sometimes change makers within cities. The first thing I've learned, and talking back to Otto's question about disruption and what am I sensing, I have learned from this, it may sound obvious, there are change makers everywhere. Some of them are city officials. Some of them are the radicals shouting outside City Hall. Some of them are quietly changing the tax code or quietly changing the regulation. Some of them are running companies. There is change makers everywhere. And when they find tools that make sense to them and that they want to pick up and use, they run with it. And that's what people are doing with the Doughnut. So here's an example from the city of Brussels that saw what Amsterdam was doing. And then the senator of Brussels said, let's do this. And they're in the process of creating their own downscale Doughnut, which they're going to launch later this month. But what's really been wonderful is communities of citizens and residents of a place have started springing up first in Amsterdam, and they inspired, again, peer-to-peer inspiration. Malaysia, I'm so glad we've got Jamila here talking today, a Malaysia meetup, Australia, Barbados, Ireland, Berlin, Cambridge, California. And then, of course, they then got together and started meeting. They're self-organizing. So I've never actually had a conversation with these people. They are self-organizing their own ways of creating this in practice. The last thing I want to say is that we began in cities and places of the global north, but we desperately want to make sure that this framework is as relevant and useful as possible to the context of places in the global south. So we were contacted by people saying, we want to use this, including some of your colleagues at UNDP, including Jamila and her colleagues in Malaysia, in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, in India, in Costa Rica, in Zambia. We brought those people together. We go where the energy is. So we said, you're the people who've contacted us, come on, let's do this together. And we've actually just had our 3rd workshop just right now. We are co-creating a new methodology, which we're going to launch in July, so that again, we can publish this and make it accessible to others. I'm going to stop sharing there and say, yes, it's the sense that change makers are everywhere. And therefore what we can valuably do with the Doughnut is create open access tools that don't tell anybody how to do, but tell people, here's a framework with some powerful questions that if you look at your place through these lenses and then adapt and answer them in ways that make sense to you, if that's useful, please pick it up and run with it. If it's not useful, find something else, that's fine. If it was useful, please share back, because there's nothing so powerful as peer-to-peer inspiration. So I'm so looking forward to hearing what Jamila's going to say, because that is peer-to-peer inspiration. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wow. So Kate, let me just ask very quickly before turning it over to Jamila, ask one follow-on question. So I'm really fascinated by what you shared. And it's basically kind of, you're an organization of, I don't know, like 5 or 7 or eight. All right. So, and then all this stuff is happening, right? Which is really activating a global groundswell or movement, right? Around change makers are everywhere. everywhere, you said. And then, but it's not always activated, right? So I'm interested in your take on your own role there. These
Oh,
people, right? What is it? What is it actually? What you're doing that is helping to move from a potential that we all can feel
yeah.
to activating that potential? How would you describe that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, let me be very clear. We are only working with, our first principle is go where the energy is. We've never once knocked on a shut door. I have never once asked anybody to use the donut, recommend it, lobby for it, persuade. Why? People find ideas useful and they know their context. So the only people we're working with are people who have chosen to use it. Sometimes people say to me, how do you persuade a government that does get it? And I say, I don't know, because I don't do that. So I'm just being really clear. We're just working with the immobilized ones. What we're doing is making tools that and the donuts become a recognized concept, although it's got a very silly name, right? And some places I know they won't touch it because what is this? And it's got a silly name. It's too playful for some people. And then other people, it's perfectly playful. Yes, I can take this to my community. Our role that we see, we want to be a small team with big impact. We don't want to become an organization of 50 people because there are so many amazing organizations out there. We would rather connect with others than become our own big institution. So we want to stay small. And that means we need to make sure we design tools that are simple enough that anyone can pick it up and do it, that it's irresistible, but also that it's changeable. And we've been contacted by quite a few people who've said, we really like this framework, one, because you haven't trademarked it or, it's not got heavy licensing on it, but also it's very open that we can adapt it. We don't want something imposed on us from where? From Oxford, from the global north. Who's it? We want something that if you give us these questions, we know the answers. We come up with the answers. And so it's clear, there's a very clear local ownership to it. And so we just play an advisory role if they ask us. And we also make sure, the last thing I'll say is, in line with this openness, we are giving these ideas away. But of course, there's always the risk that they get greenwashed, especially by business, or misunderstood and unintentionally watered down. So we are always working to balance openness with integrity. And especially in the space of business, that's the one place where anybody can pick it up and play with it. We say companies cannot use this in their marketing or their branding. We are not yet ready for that. And we will let you know when we're ready to enable that to happen. There is a risk these ideas get misunderstood, misused, or even watered down by politicians. We're just riding with that risk, because if you go the other way and say everything is going to be trademarked and licensed and examined, and that'll take decades, and the world doesn't have decades. So we're running with this one, and this is our biggest experiment, how to spread ideas, and hugely welcome input from other people and recommendations or learning from others of how to spread ideas. I have to say, Extinction Rebellion in the UK is an inspiration, in that they had 3 very clear asks. They have non-violent behavior. These are the principles, and then anybody could pick it up. And sometimes people did very silly things, and mistakes happen, and that happens. And that's the cost of enabling something to spread incredibly quickly. So we expect it will go wrong in some places, but the vast majority of people working with this will help to hold the values true.
Thank you so much, Kate. And Jamila, we are so much looking forward to hear your take on all of this. So Dr. Jamila Mahmood has served as a special advisor to the Prime Minister of Malaysia on public health since 2020, and as Undersecretary General in the IFRC since January 2016. And Jamila, before joining the IFRC, you served as chief of the Secretariat of the World Humanitarian Summit of the UN in New York and chief of the Humanitarian Response Branch of the UNFPA. So thank you so much for joining us. And maybe just to kick it off, Jamila, in your current role, really being like in very intimately involved kind of in the on the national but also subnational level in what happens in Malaysia in public health and beyond, and also in your earlier role in the IFRC, what is it that you learned that is maybe that is relevant to the conversation here, and that is relevant also to maybe the role that the UN and the UN agencies can play in this situation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Otto. Hello, everyone. I see some friends on this call, which is great. First of all, just to say that my current role as a special advisor on health is also accompanied by two other roles that I play, and that is I'm on the Economic Action Council and the Climate Action Council. So those are the highest level of policy making for the country. Now, in terms of your first question, I'll take it in two parts. One is about the UN. I often get asked, what would you advise the UN on systems change and transformation? And I always say that's not the right question to ask me, because the UN is full of advisors. But what I would say is what the UN needs to do is actually turn it around to their member states that actually are determining the future of the UN or any other significant policy, and what do they advise them? And I concur with Kate when she mentioned how, you talk to different agencies and they only see things from their perspective. And this has become a problem. So if you take the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, it's a brilliant set of goals. But if you talk to one agency, they will only focus on what they're interested in and what their donor gives them money for. And so you never get coherence, or rather it's difficult to get coherence. And therefore, member states will just play the whole game of turning it in different ways and another, and you don't get the impact that you want. So I think, every time there is a global need, a new agencies is developed in the UN. So we talk about refugees, about migrants, talk about disaster risk reduction, we talk about development, environment, women, you name it, children. And watch this space. I really think that there might be something moving on climate refugees as well. So I think literally of hundreds of issues and niche issues that don't otherwise have a home in the multilateral system just pop up here and there. And I think that, the Secretary General is an amazing man. I have a lot of respect for him. And I think he has a tough time trying to get that coherence in the UN. And then the UN looks at us, and when I say us, I speak also as now as part of the government sort of representative, and previously as civil society and so forth, that you have them also going through myopic telescope. So I think what I love about the Doughnut economics is you putting it all on one piece of paper and trying to really map out. And we got to have that big picture. And how do we get the UN, which is such a huge organization, to shift? And I worked in the IFRC, as you mentioned earlier, which is also another major bureaucracy. Even though it is national society driven, which is basically governments as auxiliary. Trying to change is very difficult. And what we attempted to do was really using futures and foresight and saying, here's what the organizations of the, or here are the future challenges we're facing, and what organization do you need to be to meet those challenges? It was very ambitious. Whether you're successful over the next 10 years with the strategy is another story. Now, coming back to what we've been talking today, what Kate has very eloquently laid out to us, I got really excited because I reached out to Kate because I read her book. And, the 6 degrees of separation, that's how it works, right? You know somebody who knows somebody, you know somebody. And I turned up at a film screening in Oxford and got to meet Kate for the first time. And then, got pulled on stage to be on the panel with her and Damien, who produced the film. And I think we both are kindred spirits. We believe in the same thing. So, by chance with COVID, I came home to get away from COVID in Europe, and it ended up, they heard I was back and I got pulled into government and had to leave my job. But it's been very interesting because when you are, working very closely with the Prime Minister and the top levels of government, you get to understand what their challenges are and their desire for that coherence as well. And again, looking at things from very siloed approaches through ministries. So with Kate's support and Andrew as well, a group of my friends, not in government, have actually come together to look at, how do we demonstrate to this country that it makes a lot of sense to apply the Doughnut economic model, the planetary health boundaries, getting that understanding, particularly using, and I use the word opportunity, not lightly, the opportunity of COVID-19 that has really forced us to re-examine, how we've been functioning the last, decades and so forth. Now, this meant that, you need to have a very clear narrative and something that people could comprehend that is very contextual. And this is why my team and I are working closely with Kate to really participate in developing this model for the Global South. So what's happened is that through engagement here, the government, the Ministry of Environment, for example, will be producing a policy paper for the cabinet on planetary health. And this is a significant shift because, looking at things from a different perspective. And the Climate Action Council that is now chaired by the Prime Minister will drive looking at, climate change as a major issue through a multidisciplinary lens. And at a personal level, a group of friends and I have also been working with one of the state leaders to make one of the, I think it's the third largest state in Malaysia, or fourth largest state in Malaysia, to turn that into a Doughnut city. So we've made a lot of progress. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we've been a bit delayed. But it was very interesting that when we actually sat down and looked at what was relevant for that state, it's very different from what is relevant in Amsterdam, very different from what may be relevant in the capital of Malaysia. So again, about, using that Doughnut economic model as not just a way to do things, but also an advocacy and a mindset change as well.
So what are examples for what's different, say,
Sure.
in a context compared to Amsterdam?
Yeah. So for us, one of the biggest challenges is housing, public housing. So, and also looking at education, quality education and transportation mobility, because when we look at our BURs for, and COP26 coming, we realized that we had actually doubled our carbon footprint in the course of 3 to 4 years. So I think that was very alarming. So, and then, again, looking at COVID-19 and how, how the planetary health boundaries have been so violated in Malaysia, and again, caught in that middle income trap, right, of needing to provide for your people, but also needing to grow your economy. So it's just unsustainable to look at things from the regular economic perspective. Now, our economists are still not so convinced, but we think that, through the health lens, we have an opportunity to convince them because, the cost of health has been so high during the pandemic. So I think it's about finding champions, finding opportunities, and not just looking at it from the, the economic perspective as economics writ large, or just a pure economic perspective, but what is it that's impacting people's lives right now? And how do we need to change? And how do you bring the economic model into that context and making it work?
Yeah, wow. I'm struck, Jamila, by it sounds like what you describe, that in your case, you have already much more progressed in, working across issues, say, of public health and climate action, right, with the council. So you see it really as different dimensions of the same situation, the same Doughnut situation.
Yeah.
And a lot more than what say is the case when you look at the UN agencies, right? So would you agree? And then I wonder if you really now go to work. So you are like primarily, I suppose, kind of coming from your governmental role. How do you bring in? You stay within government first. How do you bring in kind of the NGO, the community? How do you bring in business or not? So because if you do it as a government, it is a little more complicated in a way than doing it just as an activist.
Yeah, so I'm very privileged because my role is as a special advisor, which is I guess is a full-time job, but I don't need to be stuck to it. It's a very unusual setting. So I'm free to do anything else I want. So, which means that, the government knows me as someone who engages very frequently as part of civil society. So they leverage on my expertise to then engage with civil society. They also leverage my experience with private sector. So I'm able to actually cut across all the different sectors. Added to that, and this has all happened within 1 year, if everything goes well, then in June, I will be heading a planetary health center, which is going to be established in Malaysia, funded by the private sector, attached to an academic institution that will actually be working to help drive policy change and action, and not just research, right? It's going to be a collaborative center. And I've actually managed to convince the university, which is really wonderful, that the entire raison d'etre of the university, the entire foundation of the university is changing such that planetary health becomes the fundamental driving force of every single faculty in the university, which means that you force collaboration. Every faculty will need to demonstrate its contribution and its research and everything towards planetary health. So I think this is, if everything goes well, we launch it in June, and we'll be doing a global launch at COP26. But the aim is really to extreme collaboration, really drive this really disruptive way of working.
Wow, that is so inspiring. And I also noticed when I look at your background, kind of, working with government, having the multilateral background, creating your own NGO, working with the NGO sector, and then also with academia. So that almost to play the role, and there is a similar background also in Kate's journey, to operate in the role that the two of you operate in and embody, almost requires you to have in-depth experience from multiple sector perspectives, right? Because only that gives you probably kind of the literacy to connect to all these different audience and partners. So how is that? What is your own take on that? And kind of this, what is the most important convening? I think we are talking about new infrastructures there that enable these cross-sector collaborations and this renewal. What are you noticing there? What is the most important piece of infrastructure that you're building now, but that often is missing in other places?
If you ask me, the most important infrastructure is your mindset, the ability to unlearn and relearn. Most of the time, we are stuck with what we think are what is right, and not willing to unlearn some things which are probably not relevant now, maybe have been relevant before. So I think it starts with the individual, and it's about mindset, and then influence. And I think that's the biggest shift that needs to happen. Once that happens, things fall into place. You may not be the driver of that change, but if I give you an example, how my engagement with the Ministry of Environment and Water was through a friend, right, who happens to be the Secretary General. But going with him to look at rivers that were polluted, going with him to look at malnourished children, really getting that shift and the unlearning and relearning that you can actually do things differently. Then he, as the champion, makes the bureaucracy then shift towards what it might be better at, right? And then drawing in the private sector, drawing in academia, and then creating new models for cooperation, because it's very hard for you to tell the ministries you now cannot exist. But you can drive models of working that will allow or force each of the different actors, whether it's ministries or sectors themselves, to contribute to that. So a classic example would be the university that has decided to take on this challenge with me, is that, they will now change the entire measurement of, whatever their KPIs or performance of their different schools, based on their contribution to the thinking and action around planetary health.
Wow. Thank you so much. I have, before we go in a couple of minutes into the breakout where we, relate a little bit what we heard to our own experience, I want to, in the remaining couple of minutes, ask a closing question to each of you. And the question is this, Jamila and Kate. So you both have been working inside the UN system. You have been working outside from multiple sectors perspectives. You know the system from within and from outside. Change makers are everywhere. 150 of them in the UN context are in this conversation now, right, that we are having. So what is your advice? So if you could give those of us, kind of the 150 of us who are currently working in the UN system, trying to help it to move to the next level, help it transform actually to live up to the level of challenge that we are facing in this decade. What is if you could give one advice based on your own lived experience, what's your advice to the community of change makers that you are speaking to here?
I'll jump in. It is definitely a community of change makers here because this is a self-selecting group who've come. And I always like talking best to an audience of self-selected people because, those are the people who've chosen to lean in. I'm actually doing some work with some of the innovation teams in UNDP who contacted us saying, we like the Doughnut, we want to be part of it. And they are contributing to our Global South methodology and they're doing amazing work. And so the first thing I want to say is some of the work that's going on inside the UN, the part of I know at UNDP, is amazingly different from what was happening when I was there 20 years ago. And thank goodness, but the language of design, of systems thinking, of design thinking is completely changed. So I suppose I want to start by saying, yes, transformation, we need to transform, but I want to acknowledge that the UN and UNDP has been transforming and is bringing in ideas that definitely weren't there. And it's a really big thing also to change the HDI and bring in the planetary perspective, because that was always missing. And the Human Development Index can become almost like a golden goose. It was the thing that UNDP was famous for, but then you get locked with it. And yet thinking has moved, but we're still doing this thing because that's what we're known for. And it's really important to keep evolving. So I would say there are change makers here. And of course, in every ministry and every organization you're working with, there are change makers. How can the UN work with people in ways that enable those grounded change makers who know the context and what already needs to happen to provide them with tools and the finance and the space they need to make those changes happen? It's not, I just don't believe things happen when we impose them top down. It's when we enable people in those positions to start changing. So how can the UN embrace tools? We're embracing open design and Creative Commons with all the risks and the uncertainties that it has. And I really think there's a lot that the UN could also be doing there.
Yeah, I think I fully agree with Kate, and the UNDP has now one of my smartest colleagues in the past, Arati, who is leading your futures unit for Asia Pacific. But I think one of the things I would say is the UN itself, is not a homogeneous sort of. If I look at it, it's very different agencies, and what happens in New York is very different from what happens in another field operations or something like that. So my advice would be, start local. I mean, really, you can influence change locally. And I think I come back to the coherent narrative that you make to member states. And you can start from as low local unit as possible to bring that awareness and, make things happen and work there that can then grow and then, be strong examples and inspiration and incentives for governments and politicians to bring forward.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. We'll take a 10-minute segment now to go into breakouts. After that, we'll return here and have a closing conversation. I want to, I think, Jamila, it's already pretty late for you. I want to already thank you. You probably will not be able to stay on for the remainder of the conversation. Thank you so much. And for the breakout questions, so you will find yourself in a small group and you just, introduce yourself, your name, where you're from, and then what is the key inspiration? What was it that resonated most with from the stories that we heard Kate and Jamila sharing with us? And when you look at that, how might you apply that to your own work? Change makers are everywhere. That's how it started. How can it start with you? So that's kind of the breakout, and then we'll kind of reconvene here for a short closing conversation. Enjoy the conversation. And just hit join to move into your breakout group.
Everyone is just about back. So what we can do is just begin to type in the chat what came up for you in your breakout. And if you would like to share or inspiration or question that you're holding, we can do that with the raise hand function. So at the bottom of your screen, you can click reactions and raise your hand. I saw someone earlier had their hand raised before we went into the breakout. So Lisa, I see you again. If you'd like to come in.
Thanks, Antoinette and colleagues. Thank you, Kate. And if Jamila is still here, that was such a really nourishing discussion to get us off. Our group was really constrained by time, and so we didn't get to hear so much. But one thing that at least I tabled that was really bouncing in my mind was about mindset and the core challenge. I think that the Presencing Institute and UNDP, by holding this forum, is helping us to validate that how we as individual selves navigate complexity like this is legitimate. Because to unlearn and to relearn and to pivot and to navigate these very complex questions is a whole identity endeavor, a whole identity kind of exercise. And what was coming in my mind as you were talking, Kate, especially, was I was wondering how often you get challenged on boundaries, planetary boundaries, because I sense that when I watch the discourse, that many of us want to expand the boundaries. We want to say, well, maybe humanity is not constrained by planetary boundaries. Maybe our destiny is to evolve into interplanetary life and therefore expand our boundaries. And I can't tell if that's evolutionary thinking or straight up delusionary thinking. I can't tell what is that completely nihilistic, I think, or if there's a kind of the consciousness-based approach, which can help us to just be in that tension. I mean, I have my views, but I'm wondering, Kate, maybe to you and other colleagues, I know you punted on that question earlier. You said, if someone is not convinced of this, maybe it's not my place to sit around and waste my energy trying to persuade them. But I think it is a fundamental question about if we take a consciousness-based approach, it pretty much gives us a bias to reconciling ourselves to the bliss of living in balance. But that's not a consensus view. And we have to then, as groups of people, reconcile that. So I guess I'd like to invite you once again, Kate, to respond to that pushback. Thank you so much.
I'm really happy to respond that. Otto, do you want me to respond straight away? Yes, great. Brilliant question. Love it. Yes. So just to be very clear, though, if somebody says, oh, I don't believe in planetary boundaries, I don't say, oh, it's not my place to persuade. I will jump right in and have that conversation. What I don't do is say to someone, hey, you should use the donut. Go on, use it in your city. I've never pushed it on anybody, but I love talking about the concept. So when I first drew the diagram of the donut, when I was working at Oxfam, so it's got the planetary boundaries on the outside and the social, it's got its boundaries. It's all about boundaries, right? You like to push your boundaries. And actually, it had to get signed off across Oxfam to be published. And very interestingly, I'll tell you a little story. My colleagues in Oxfam across the world said, especially in Oxfam America, they said, no, we don't need this new theory. And it wasn't introduced as Oxfam policy. It was published as a discussion paper. It was just like, here's an idea, because Oxfam didn't, and this is what happens when new ideas come along. They didn't want to publish it as a policy, and I know there's now some people in Oxfam thinking, why did we let that one go? And actually, in a way, it's the best thing that could have happened to it. It forced me ultimately to leave. I was told, when you present the donut, you can't say we Oxfam, you have to say I. Which, for somebody who'd worked first at the UN and then at Oxfam and was totally used to being part of this institution, to be told you're not allowed to use the family name, this is you alone. It was absolutely alienating. And I remember saying actually to a colleague who was a media colleague, I said, they're telling me when this public, I have to say I, that feels horribly ego, me alone up front. And she just said, run with it. And I thought, oh, okay, see the good side. If it's just me, I can say, I can be silly, I can be funny, I can make jokes, I can ask risky things, I can innovate, and not in the name of Oxfam, and it means I can take risks. And so I flipped that round. But sorry, I'm going off on a tangent, but I know it's relevant to all this mind shift work. One of my American colleagues said she saw the planetary boundaries, and she said, we Americans, when we see these boundaries, we just want to shoot right through them. That's the American way. And I thought, well, yeah, that's the frontier story. But really? I said, really? So if you had a baby in your arms and this baby, her temperature was going over 40 degrees, would you say to this baby, you go for it, girl, you shoot right through that boundary? No, you would not. You would do everything you could to bring her temperature down. Why? Because at the level of the human body that health lies in balance. Everything about our bodies tells us whether our temperature, how much food we eat, how much oxygen we get, how much exercise we do, how much pressure we put on our body. It's all about balance, and it's living within boundaries that keeps us alive. So if only we can take that deep understanding from the human body and take it to the planetary body, it utterly makes sense that there are boundaries we should respect. Now, the last thing, I loved what you started talking about, people who say we need to kind of get off this planet and go beyond. And is that amazing evolution or is that delusion? I've talked about this a lot with my partner, who's called Roman Krasnarek, who's written a wonderful book called The Good Ancestor about long-term thinking. And some long-term thinkers say, yeah, the long-term thinking, we just got to get off this planet and into other solar systems. And talking about it, we said, well, even for those who want to get off this planet, like think of climbing to the top of Mount Everest. Okay, your goal is to reach the peak of the mountain. The first rule is you do not destroy base camp. So even if you think the big dream of humanity is to get off this planet, You do not destroy base camp planet Earth in the process. In fact, you have to have a healthy, well-supplied base camp if you're going to have any chance of getting off this planet. So sort this place out first if you think you're going to use it as a springboard somewhere else.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Kate, for the beautiful question and response. I also see PC 617, and you've had your hand raised for a little while, so I wonder if you'd like to bring in your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm sorry, I think my name hasn't appeared, but my name is Kenyatta from the UK. Yes, I just want to go back to the non-coherence between the member states. When I heard about that, coming from DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, I had this, I'll say, bad feelings. But the major issue for me is when we looked at what has been going on in Congo from decade up until now, and we are still talking about how we can make this, how we can make the 2030 more efficient and effectively. Since I joined this group, I never heard anyone talking about the Democratic Republic of Congo. The digitalizations, so majority of items that will be needed to make this happen, so it came from there. But I can't understand how we are not trying to approach these issues that are being kneeing the Congolese themselves down, and the resources that we need in order to make our, in order to meet our goal. So I just want to understand, why can't we also step in that path of the world and see what solutions can we bring along? And especially when the policy makers and everyone knows who are the perpetrator of this turmoil going on down there. So what the world, I don't know, it's really, I'm very speechless. So back to you, the audience. Yeah.
Can I jump in with a comment? I definitely don't have an answer in that. And Kenyatta, hi, good to hear you speak. And your name was almost this PC 617. It's like, this is the name of somebody who's going to go to Mars. This is, and it was lovely to see the person behind the digital name. The issue you just raised is so important, and I just want to tell one story about it. So this is, as I held up, this is the city portrait of the city of Amsterdam, where we downscale the donut for the city of Amsterdam. And if you remember when I showed the 4 lenses, it's how can the people of this city thrive? How can this city thrive within its habitat? How can we respect the health of the whole planet? How can we respect the well-being of people worldwide? And that last lens I just mentioned, the people through global supply chains. So when we put together Amsterdam City Portrait, we took food, clothing, electronics, and construction materials, and we gathered together labor supply chain research that's been done by brilliant academics for decades about the labor rights through these global supply chains. And then we put them together against the Sustainable Development Goals. So you said you're not hearing people talk about DRC, and I'm so pleased I can now read to you from the City Portrait of Amsterdam that it says, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, children work 12-hour days for $1 or $2, carrying sacks of cobalt, a mineral used to make batteries for mobile phones. There's again, we have problems with our lungs and pain all over our bodies, says a female cobalt miner from the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's also quotes on this page from garment workers in Bangladesh, food workers in the United States, people whose work is being transported into cities like Amsterdam and all cities of the global north. Now, When we first created this and we handed it in to our colleagues in the city of Amsterdam, they looked through the local story about the city and the local ecology. They looked at their impact on planetary boundaries, which is not pretty. They're massively overshooting planetary boundaries. But when they came to this page, they said, no, 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 this is horrible. No, no, this doesn't feel like my city. That there are thousands of workers on Ghanaian cocoa plantations on enforced labor. This isn't my city. Take this out. No, 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 no. If you hand this into the city government, this won't get through. And we had to have a really interesting conversation at that moment saying, listen, the overshoot of planetary boundaries is equally shocking and appalling. And this is true of your city. I mean, this is true. So this is part of your city's portrait. And we do need to talk about people in Democratic Republic of Congo and Ghana and Bangladesh. If it wasn't true, the city of Amsterdam would not be home to the company called Fairphone, which makes mobile phones that aim to be free of exploitative labor. It would not be home to Tony's Chocolonely, which aims to make slave-free chocolate. It wouldn't be home to the Clean Clothes campaign, which has campaigned for decades for garment workers' rights worldwide. And to their credit, the policymakers in Amsterdam saw that, and then they turned around 100%. And now when I hear the deputy mayor of Amsterdam go on the radio and talk about their city portrait, she talks about this. She says, you know, Amsterdam is the port into which the most cocoa comes from Europe. And we are connected to plantations in Ghana that have forced labor. And this is part of our story. So somebody wrote in the chat, you know, no country is developed unless every country is developed. And one of the ways we're trying to do this is to show the deep interconnections, to help people in the global north who are often so unaware that the privilege of having this and the connection and the community it gives me and the access and the education it gives me, it depends upon those people working in Democratic Republic of Congo. So this is just one story about making it impossible to ignore.
Kate, thank you so much. Kenyatta, thank you for your question as well. What we'd like to do now is to turn to Kelvie Bird and the image that she has been creating during our session, and to open just a moment of resonance and just landing with all that we have heard and all that we've been taking in for the last 90 minutes or so, and just noticing what we're seeing, what we're sensing, and what we're feeling as we take a look at this image. And Kelvie, I'm curious, as we do that, if you have any comments to share.
No, we can just go ahead and do the resonance process. Yeah, thanks, Antoinette.
Thank you, Kelvie. Wonderful. This is a powerful image. So just sitting with what we're seeing, sensing, and feeling, we'll take just a moment of stillness to be with it. And as you stay with this image, you can start typing in the chat what is coming up for you. What are you seeing, sensing, and feeling? And you can put that using the prompt, I see, I sense, I feel. And I will read a few of them out. I see boundaries transgressed. I see a shared we. I sense mindsets unlocking. I feel hope. I see a recalibration or resetting. I sense consciousness expanding. I see the collective mirror at the root of everything. I see a big responsibility in front of us and endless possibilities ahead. I see mindset shift. I feel, oof, this is challenging for myself. I see endless change, sense more and more hope to connections and interlinkages. I feel happy to reconnect with UNDP and Oxfam colleagues familiar and new. We are always passing through and belong inside and outside. I see a world not in balance, but I feel hope, a better world and society. I see our portrait and how we change our portrait to something more hopeful. I sense an urgency. Thank you all for sharing and you know, sharing the different pieces that are coming up for all of us as we sit with this. I feel that the resonance will continue after this moment, and you know, the resonance from this conversation will really continue on as we go into the rest of our days and the rest of our lives. And the hope is that with this lens of what we've just heard, we can carry that forward into our systems, into our contexts, and our lives and heart. So thank you all for participating in that. And you've got a little animal friend to just begin our closing here. So as we close, I'd like to just remind that we are we have Spark Blue, where you can find the resources from the session. You can find a continued conversation and the former dialogues that we've had. You'll find the recording of this dialogue as soon as we can get it up there. And continued resources. We also have the final dialogue of our series happening on June 3rd. So tune in for that dialogue, and we look forward to continuing. So thank you all. Thank you, Kate. A big thank you to Jamila also, and to the whole team for putting this together. It's really been just a fascinating and provocative in the best of ways conversation. So thank you all. We can all unmute and say goodbye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Good session. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Greetings from
Thank you.
Kampala.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very
Bye.
much.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.